Kia ora, ladies and gentlemen. This is Leonard for the Ultimate Growth Experience podcast. Today, I have a very special guest, Louisa Wall. She is the current Labour Party MP for Manurewa. She is a former sportswoman who represented Aotearoa in both netball as the Silver Fern and rugby union player as a member of the Black Ferns. She is a well-known New Zealand public for her support for LGBT rights and for the gay marriage legislation that passed in 2013. Her achievements are substantial. She was the New Zealand Women's Rugby Player of the Year in 1997, was a world champion for the Black Ferns in 1998, and now a potential minister for the current Labour government. Good to be with you.
Kia ora, Leonard. Thank you very much for the invitation.
No problem. So you are the first former sports person to be on my podcast. So how different is the experience between being a sports person and a politician?
Actually, they're quite similar in many ways, but they're also incredibly different. The similarities for me have been in preparation. So for sport, like anything in life, you have to put in the hard yards, hard work, which meant having really good programs so that you could get your body and your mind in a position to perform as part of a team. So I played team sports, netball, rugby, as you've said. And actually politics is the same. You know, depending on what role you're allocated, you have to understand the context of that role. So I currently chair the Health Select Committee. I'm on the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Select Committee. And within that context, we obviously have priorities that the government are trying to push through in terms of legislative reform. And so you have to understand what the game plan is essentially, but also be fit for purpose and be able to contribute on the field in the sport area, and politically same. You have to be able to contribute at the select committee or guide discussions and understand what we're trying to achieve and be able to communicate that with the public. I think the differences though are, sport is a lot more transparent in terms of you play a game. In netball you score goals, in rugby you score tries, and then you kick conversions, and it's really easy after 80 minutes or 60 minutes to know who's won the game. I think politics isn't like that. It's sometimes difficult to know who's won the game because we essentially have a game that doesn't end. Like it's a continuous kind of process, and even when you have discrete processes like the medicinal cannabis legislation that has been going through the Health Committee. Now, you know, there is no definitive beginning and end. You just have different processes. First reading, which then sends the bill to select committee. We had over 1,700 submissions. Over 350 people wanted to be heard. We then went through a process as a select committee to, write a report. At the same time, some of my National Party colleagues were writing their own bill, and so kind of changed the landscape a little bit, but we presented our report to the House and now we're waiting for second reading. So as I said, sport is definitive and it's transparent, whereas politics is a little bit cloudy, not so definitive, and you don't know when the game sometimes begins and ends. So it's hard to know sometimes who won, for example. Every 3 years we find out who won because the public have an opportunity to vote. So yeah, some similarities, but as I've been able to highlight, some also distinct differences.
Well, obviously politics is a game of sort of like a debate between political ideas and telling the public, hey, which one do you think is more likely to be correct? So it's like a
but it's also about like highlighting what the issues are for society.
Correct. Yes.
And so there's always this debate about in another space they call it, you identify what the issues are, and then there's this thing called intervention logic where, you have to have agreement on what the problems are and then what the possible solutions are. And you're absolutely right, the political process is about us saying as a government, these are our issues, these are the problems society is facing, these are our solutions to those issues that we've prioritised, and then having the conversation with the public about why they are the issues that we as a government want to focus on, why our solutions are the best solutions, and why we've prioritised those, I guess within a context of having a whole lot of other competing issues and priorities that other political parties or other stakeholders in our society may want to highlight. But in that process, I believe it's still a dynamic process where sometimes the community itself can say, these are our priorities, these are our issues, and we want you to address these and prioritise these. So, I mean, politics is a dynamic set of engagements, but ultimately what the government does do is prioritise how we distribute the resources that we have through collection of taxes, and our ability to get re-elected is premised on the public accepting what we've decided are the priorities, accepting the solutions that we've posed, and then investing in us again through elections to continue to govern.
So which one do you enjoy more, the sports or the politics?
Oh, look, they're both passions, and I guess that's something that I've always done in my life. I found passionate pursuits. Sport for me was something incredibly natural. I didn't think about it. I just realised early on I wanted to play rugby for New Zealand and play netball for New Zealand.
And you were talented, obviously.
And I was, so I had an aptitude, but I also grew up in an environment where generally sport is something that we as New Zealanders appreciate, value, and I also grew up in a household where my father was like a diehard All Black fan. So, you know, it didn't matter when they played, where they played, if they were on at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning, our family would always be up watching, supporting. He played for College Old Boys in Taupo, and I played for College Old Boys as a 5-year-old. So
the boys team as a 5-year-old.
Yeah, I did. I was the only girl.
That's impressive.
So that was in the 70s, and it was hilarious when I think back now, because at the end of the season, they were like, oh my God, a girl played rugby? Like I was the only girl. And then they banned me.
Oh.
Because girls weren't supposed to play rugby. So I've kind of come through an era in the 70s where it wasn't acceptable for girls to play rugby, to then playing for the Black Ferns in the 80s and then the 90s, and being part of a successful Black Ferns team. But ultimately I ended up playing netball first because that was the acceptable sport for women.
Yes. Wow. I mean, all I can say is your career from sports to now in politics is just, I mean, I can't imagine myself doing something that big myself yet. So why politics though? So what are you determined to do in Parliament? Obviously the gay marriage legislation is one of your biggest achievements, but what else?
Well, I think why politics firstly was about, again, growing up in a household where my father served our community as the chair of our Waitahanui Marae Committee for over 30 years. He was on the Board of Trustees for Waitahanui Primary School that I attended, my 2 brothers and my sister attended, and even after we'd left he still remained on the board there. He then was a board member at Aotearoa College where I went to high school. He was a foundation pupil there, and then he was on the Tū Whare Māori Trust Board. So, you know, I think when you grow up in a family that prioritises, I guess, service to the community and being involved in governance of different entities within the community, that kind of provided me with an opportunity to give back. I mean, these domains, I think, are for people who want to be involved in collective action, community action, and do so through, you know, putting their time into endeavours that is all about the community good and the public good.
Yes.
And then why politics? Well, I ended up, after doing a diploma in sport and recreation, which was all about my sport, because I was a Silver Fern. My coach, Lynn Parker, got me into the course. I ended up doing a 4-year degree in social policy and social work. And after the 4 years, realised I didn't want to be a social work practitioner. I actually wanted to work with the system, which is why I did a master's in social policy. And so you can either become a bureaucrat when you have a degree like that and work with the system, or you become a politician and you develop legislation that actually then is the framework for a system that is supposed to deliver resources to New Zealanders who need it. And so that's what I chose to do, and align myself with the Labour Party, coming from a family that was staunchly union. So I've been a member of the Service and Food Workers Union since I was 12, washing dishes in Taupo at Cobb & Co. To now my membership with E2. And so for me, that whole collective ethos is what has driven my political participation.
That sums up why I'm in the Labour Party and why I joined in the first place as well, as being a social democrat myself. So the gay marriage legislation was quite famous in YouTube and social media because of Maurice Williamson's gay rainbow speech. So in that moment, like, what was that feel? Was it euphoric? Was it uplifting?
Well, the whole, marriage equality debate, the ability for same-sex couples, or any couple actually, regardless of sex, sexual orientation.
And you're married yourself, aren't you?
Yeah, I am, thank you, or gender identity to get married. It was really interesting, that third reading speech night, because Morris and I were in the house together, like, early, before anyone else had arrived, and he was really pumped up. And Morris had communicated with me throughout and was like, I just don't understand why people want to involve themselves in other people's private affairs. Like, why does it matter to me who you want to marry, who anyone else wants to marry? It's none of my business. It's a private issue. And so on the actual night, it was incredibly special to be part of a process that, when I'd looked at international experiences, had led to conflict, violence, and in fact death. So France, if we look at what happened in France after ours, someone actually killed themselves in protest.
Goodness.
Committed suicide. And there was a lot of violence afterward. And what happened in our parliament was, although there was the highest number of submissions that we've ever received, 21,533, up till the end of life choice bill, that is. Our discussion and debate was, I believe, civilised, it was respectful, it was mature. And what I saw happen after the fact, which is what the BBC was completely preoccupied with when I spoke to them the next morning, was the singing of the Waiata, was Pōkari Kariana, and the fact that we broke out into song and kind of sang this Māori love song, and how that really did inspire the world, that we could have these hard discussions about, I think, things that historically had been deemed morally unacceptable, where the Crown had legislated against the LGBT community, because obviously it was a criminal offence if you were a gay male in New Zealand up to 1986. But the fact that we got to a point in our history as a country where we could actually, I believe, realise aspects of what fundamental human rights are and look like. And that is, all people are born free and equal in dignity and rights, that as equal citizens, which was my argument essentially, the state was discriminating, and it was inappropriate in a modern democratic society. And it was really about us looking at ourselves and saying, just because historically the state has discriminated, because we were colonised and every piece of legislation that we had was imported from the United Kingdom, and that they went through homosexual law in 1967, and in fact they were too going through the same discussion about marriage equality. There's a point in I think a country's history where they actually have to be really critical about where these pieces of legislation come from, where the inherent discrimination comes from. And it was because the UK Parliament, there was no separation of church and state. In fact, the Anglican Church was part of the state. Even
now in the House of Lords.
Yeah, which is actually where we got all these historic, archaic legislation from. And so for us to actually be a mature nation in our own right, I think was a symbol of where we're going. So yes, I do believe eventually we will become a republic. And that wasn't even a question you were going to ask me.
I don't know. Well, I had to talk with Dr. Brash, and I think he would disagree with that. But well, a lot of people would agree with you as well simultaneously. So speaking of legislation, can you provide the listeners what it's like to be finally in government, and how do the procedures work? So I know the brief, so the first reading, then the select committee, then the second, then the third, and then finally to the Governor General, and it passes. So can you explain to the listeners about
that process? So what usually happens is that ministers have pieces of legislation that become part of their work program and that they prioritise. So within the Health Select Committee, for example, we've got Minister of Health David Clark, we have Associate Ministers of Health Julian Genter, and we also have Jenny Salisa. So actually I'll look at Jenny Salisa because her legislation hasn't yet come to us, but we know that as the Associate Minister of Health, she's also responsible for Māori and Pacific health and also for the whole issue of awahi kore smoke-free. So as a country, we have an aspiration to be smoke-free by 2025. Now, there's been a bit of a challenge around whether or not we're going to achieve that smoke-free vision, which is less than 5% of New Zealanders smoking. But a critical aspect that has just come through recently because of the advocacy of the Children's Commissioner is that we should have spaces that are smoke-free if adults are infringing on the rights of children. So there's a big push at the moment for smoke-free cars, for example. Now that kōrero has been around for 5 years at least, and in some countries longer. So in Canada and in Australia, they've actually legislated. And the rationale behind it is that adults shouldn't be doing anything that harms children, and actually second-hand smoke harms children.
Yes.
And so actually having a piece of legislation that is going to prohibit adults from smoking in cars and then create a regime where there's fines, just like you're not allowed to use your phone to text when you're driving.
While driving, yeah.
So that process at the moment means that the Honourable Jenny Salisa has to take a paper to Cabinet, has to be signed off. Once it's signed off, then she will have a draft piece of legislation that she will then, through engagement with the Leader of the House, decide when the first reading will take place. Now that first reading is an opportunity for the Parliament to say whether or not it's a priority. So just because it's a priority for the Minister and the Government, it doesn't mean it's a priority for the Parliament. But at that first reading, you get an indication about kind of what we talked about before. Is this an issue that is a priority for the country?
Mm-hmm.
Is the solution proposed through legislation something that everyone agrees on, or a majority in the Parliament agree on? And if the answer is yes, that legislation passes its first reading and then is allocated to a select committee. Now that will be allocated to the Health Select Committee, which I chair. We will then call for submissions, and normally we allow a 6-week process for people to submit on the bill. And that process really is about, do I agree with the legislation, and I might agree with it but think that there are flaws in it, and I will propose amendments. And so what the Select Committee then does, it is with officials, it assesses all those submissions. So we have written submissions, we also have an ability for people to make oral submissions. We can get other advice if we think it's necessary. And at the end of that process, and sometimes that can take a long time because it depends how many submissions you receive, and we will always hear from someone who wants to be heard. We then will write a report, and the outcome and objective of that process is for the Select Committee to be robust. And so we hear from people across the political spectrum about changes they may anticipate. And the best case scenario is that the committee reports back to the House unanimously. And it's either we recommend that the bill passes with the amendment shown. Now in some cases where there is disagreement, we won't be able to reach that conclusion. And the committee that I chair, it's actually tied 4-4. So unless we get consensus with the national members, and my deputy chair is Dr. Shane Reti, and I have to say he's wonderful to work with, and we always work constructively, and what we try to do is to find consensus and incorporate everybody's feedback into the process. And mostly we've been able to report the bills back unanimously with a certain number of changes that, if accepted at second reading, become incorporated into a revised bill. Then there is another process, which is the committee stage debate, where individual members of the House can propose other amendments. And that's the penultimate step before the third reading debate, which is, this is the bill that we've all agreed as a House should proceed. We have a third reading debate and a vote. And in an ideal world, if we've gone through a rigorous, robust process, we all agree, and we produce a piece of legislation that has that input from the public, input across the political spectrum, and that we agree on, and then, you're right, goes to the Governor-General, who signs it off, and then it becomes the law.
And royal assent, and therefore law.
Yeah, that's right.
That's
so,
a really complicated process. Wow.
It's a process where there's a lot of negotiation, but there's also a lot of consolidation around the themes and the feedback that we receive. And I try to work in a collaborative way and actually give effect to especially issues that the community bring to the table, because a lot of the people who present, it's usually because the legislation that we're debating is incredibly relevant to their lives, like the medicinal cannabis legislation. We had a lot of people who were using cannabis medicinally who suffered from cancers, quite a few disability sector groups, so neuromuscular disease, multiple sclerosis, people who suffer chronic pain, and actually having a regime where it's legal for them to purchase medicinal cannabis was really, really important. So we heard from people who I consider to be quite vulnerable, marginalised, in pain, suffering, and yeah, it was quite intense actually.
I'm hoping to see that legalised, since in Canada they just recently legalised, and obviously Colorado and other countries, but it's up to the Parliament.
It is up to the Parliament, that's absolutely right.
I've heard that the Select Committee is actually quite civil, despite a lot of the disagreements, and in contrast to what's going on in the US, it's very much sort of like
the health particularly, and also foreign affairs, to be quite frank, because a lot of the bills that come through are usually our ratification of international conventions that we've signed. So there is a lot of, unanimous and philosophical agreement about how we want to behave within an international context. And also the Foreign Affairs Committee does receive all of the international visitors. So we speak to those groups usually from a very united position, because we're the spokespeople, advocates for the country. And actually we have international groups as well, where we have Interparliamentary Union, the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, the Parliamentarians for Global Action, which my colleague Ross Robertson was the president of in the previous parliaments. But when we go overseas internationally, we are representing our country. It's a bit like sport actually, and so we want to work together. So this theory that it's all conflict, that's not so, but probably the most conflicting part of it has been question time, and then some of the debates depending on what the bill is before the House.
That's what the public sees, so they always think it's all this game and sort of what do you call it, conflicting zone, but more or less actually quite civil.
Select committees usually are, because we want to produce the best legislation for the people.
So you had a taste of success and excellence throughout your career in sports and politics. So in the beginning of your life, what was the main trigger that got you motivated towards heading the direction of success?
I actually think it was innate. It was just something that I was gifted from I call it from my tupuna, my ancestors. And also growing up in a family where I had a mother and a father who loved me unconditionally and encouraged and supported me. So I think that ability to feel secure and then actually project out to the world was through the love of my family. But that whole passion and desire and competitiveness just was there. I've always loved winning. I'll just be really honest. I hated losing, hated it with vengeance. and then became quite, some people would say obsessed, but I remember in 1987 when I was watching the Silver Ferns win the Netball World Cup over in Glasgow, and they were playing in the middle of the night, and I'd get up, but I'd also tape the games and watch them, and I'd watch them like 5-6 times.
Wow.
Same game, but I'd watch different players, and I would I was just completely possessed about being a Silver Fern and representing my country. And my father put a goal up outside of our house, and at midnight in the middle of winter he'd have to come and tell me to get inside because
Wow.
I'd be practicing my goals. And it was just, I think when you're a competitive sports person, it's an unconscious thing. Like, I didn't consciously think, oh, I want to do this. It was just got me out of bed. Like, I was just incredibly passionate about and motivated to play, and it was any sport. Play rugby. I was involved in karate. I played tennis, played basketball, volleyball. I played everything until eventually I started getting into representative teams, and then had to choose, and I chose netball, and then chose rugby, and I was really lucky actually because of Lynn Parker's intervention. So I was 17, I was in the 7th form, I got in the Silver Ferns, and at the end of that year Lynn intervened and called my dad and said, please send Louisa to me in Hamilton, I can get her into a university course. So it was a joint Waikato University, Waikato Tech course with a whole lot of other sports people. But after that 2-year diploma, I then went on to university, and I spent 5 years at university. So that's 7 years of tertiary study, in addition to being a Silver Fern and then a Black Fern. And for me, education and sport was, fit really nicely together. And I think, for a lot of people who aren't successful at school, actually we can be successful at anything in life.
That's
you just have to apply the same principles of preparation, of understanding what your role is, of understanding what the greater role is. So, in the Black Ferns we had playbooks, and those playbooks would outline, the different moves that we'd make strategically at different parts of the field and the calls. And actually, if you learnt the playbook and you knew your role and specific moves, that's preparing for that is just like preparing for me for an exam or preparing for any area in life. You just have to understand the philosophy behind it, the rationale behind it, what your role in that is, understand what we're trying to achieve. And a lot of what I do in politics is to communicate that so people actually understand what a Labour Party stands for, what our values and beliefs are, what a social democratic country stands for, what human rights are, what they look like, and I really enjoy that aspect of my work, because you actually do have to communicate in a manner that people understand what you're saying. And so I hope I do that to a degree that means people are really clear, and what we do is transparent, and we're not trying to hide anything. And whether or not people like it or not is different from them understanding why we're doing it.
Yes. Yeah, precisely. So passion, organisation, whānau.
Yeah.
And and just that unconscious side, right? Because you're quite similar to Melissa Lee, because she talked about how she was very competitive with the boys in Korea when she was younger.
Yeah.
And I see sort of like that power. You're sort of like your netball friend, isn't she?
She is my netball friend.
Mel, if you're listening, say hi.
Actually, I've got to say, Mel and we like singing together as well. So we're both in the crossbenches, and we will be performing on the 6th of December at the British High Com.
That's brilliant.
And I think it's never been hard for me to be clear about what I believe and what I'm prepared to fight for. I mean, I'm not a sit on the fence, ambiguous person. I'm definitive.
Principled.
Yeah, thank you. Principled. I usually take positions based on principle, and try and be objective, and try not to be overcome with emotion. I try to
be reasonable and rational. Fair point. Did you have any political heroes that inspired you to be in this position? Was it Helen Clark or like Jacinda? Or,
Oh, no, I mean, to be perfectly honest, my political heroes have been my parents first and foremost, my dad, and his leadership of our community growing up. So, you know, if anyone motivated me more than anybody else, it was my father. And then I guess when I became aware, people like Mere Te Taimangakahia, which you may not know who she is.
Not really, no, I need to learn.
And Mere Te Taimangakahia was a suffragist, and she was involved in the Kotahitanga Parliament. So at the same time, Kate Shepherd and the suffragettes in New Zealand were fighting for the right for women to vote. Mere was actually not only fighting for the right for women to vote, but also for women to stand. And she was incredibly progressive. And people won't know, this year is the 125th anniversary of suffrage.
I knew that.
So in 1893, women fought for and won the right to vote by collaborating with the men of the day who had the power, who voted for us to be able to vote. But what a lot of people don't realise is that the reason we were prohibited from voting was because women weren't defined as people. So there was a thing called the Persons Act in Canada, in the UK, and so they changed the definition of person to include woman, but what they explicitly did at the same time was prohibited women from the ability to stand for Parliament. And in fact it took another 26 years in New Zealand before a woman was allowed to stand, and then 40 years after we won the right to vote, before Elizabeth McCombs in 1933 became the first woman Member of Parliament.
A Labour MP as well, yes?
Yeah, Labour MP. But that's been quite an interesting revelation, because Mere said we should be able to vote and stand, and in fact the Kotahitanga Parliament enabled that in 1898, and then they were disbanded. So within the Maori context, I think we're a lot more progressive, and it would be great if people knew about her. And so I've been working with Mere's whānau, and also with Reserve Bank, because the aspiration actually is for $10 notes to also have Mere Te Taimangakahia on them.
Good luck. I think that'll be a good addition.
Thank you. It will be. And actually I think through money we can tell a story.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, about our country's history. And in other jurisdictions, I know the United States had this whole series of historical iconic women that told a story about slavery, that told the story about women's emancipation, vocationally and also politically, and yeah.
Totally that. So you are a role model for many women, LGBT people and others. What advice would you give them?
Just advice generally. I mean,
Yes.
I think follow your passions and follow your motivation. I mean, I learnt really early on that no one else can tell you what motivates you. Like, what's going to get you out of bed? What got me out of bed was sport. What got me out of bed was actually sport, and then when I was also aspiring to finish my degree and to be able to live a reasonable life. I mean, not a lot of people know, but I got through university by cleaning. I was a cleaner for
Wow.
3 years, and some days I'd have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning twice a week to clean before I then went to university or did any of my training. And I mean, I think from my perspective, you know, it's harder today than in my day, because there's so much noise in the world. I'll just call it noise, distraction. But it was easy for me to get out of bed because I had this motivation to be a Silver Fern, right? And so life was pretty easy, because you end up organising yourself around the passion, what gets me out of bed every day, preparing, doing my training, playing my games, etc. So that's what I really want, is for our young people to have many opportunities in life to find out what their passion and motivation
What
is.
gets them going?
Yeah, like no one else can determine for you what's going to get you out of bed. And I think whatever passion and motivation our young people have, we need to support them in that pursuit.
Absolutely.
And support them 100%, and not tell them they can't do it, or it's no good, or it won't lead to anything. Because what makes us happy, and that's where the whole happiness for me comes in, is what also makes us get out of bed and invest our time in preparing for these different opportunities that life has. But that's for us to determine, not for somebody else to say this is what you should do or you must do.
Yes.
Because I think that's where a lot of unhappiness and depression comes from.
The enforcement, essentially, on people to you should do this,
Yeah.
rather than
Yeah.
what do you want out of life.
Exactly. What do you want to do? What's your goal? What's your aspiration? Yeah.
Totally that. In terms of getting out of bed,
Yeah.
what are your habits like daily? I ask this to every guest.
Oh no, look, I've had to, and this is as I've gotten older. I used to be a really good trainer when I was in the Black Ferns and in the Silver Ferns, because I had a program. But for me, it was the program would help me perform and play. And so actually when I stopped playing competitive sport, it was really difficult, because I didn't just go to the gym to go to the gym. And I've never gone to the gym because I wanted to look good. I've always gone to the gym.
That's what I
because
do.
because I had a program, right? And
Yeah.
it was always about the competition. And so that's been a real challenge, because I know that for me, managing the stress of my job, I need to get up and go to the gym.
You do that every morning?
I do that every morning,
Wow.
like this morning. So what have I done? And I have a Fitbit, and I've done 8,858 steps.
Wow.
So 12,000 is the goal for the day.
It's 11 in the morning as well.
Yeah, so I have done some exercise this morning, but when I'm in Wellington particularly, and it gets really hard because it's relative, sometimes I don't get to bed until after midnight, but I always try and get up between 5:30 and 6. And we're fortunate. I live, just opposite Parliament, and we have a facility at Parliament where I can jump on a treadmill, jump on a stepper, do weights. There's a pool there. I don't use the pool, but I try, when the house is sitting, to go to the gym at least Wednesday. Well, yeah, because we arrive sometimes on Tuesday mornings. I'm going down a lot more on a Monday, so at least 3 times a week down there. And then when I'm home, I try and exercise at least 2 or 3 other days. But the biggest challenge, to be quite honest, is around food and alcohol. Because every event you go to, there's food.
Yes.
And every event you go to, especially the ones that are held in Parliament during the dinner breaks, you can have a beer or wine, and I've got a golden rule. I will not drink if I'm in the house. So if I'm speaking or if I'm on house duty. And then for a little while there, I wasn't drinking in Wellington at all, because it just does impact on your ability, I believe, to prepare and be good to fight the cause the next day. But that's why for me, actually going to the gym is really important. But also I acknowledge that actually having a glass of wine, because it's a relaxant, does enable you to talk things through. I've got, friends and confidants that I talk through things with, and sometimes they're things to do with legislation going through the house and dilemmas that I have, or, feeling that it's really difficult to try and include all the different voices, and especially when you've got pieces of legislation where, they're tricky. There's a lot of compromise, and that only can happen, I think, through dialogue and discussion sometimes. But also I've found, for me, that singing is really important. So I've joined the crossbenchers this year, and so we've sung at a few events. And also I co-captain the Parley Ferns. So I've also realised that sport and netball and being part of a collaborative group across the house. And I also co-chair the cross-party women's group.
Oh, brilliant.
As well. So I have a lot of other areas and groups and things that I'm passionate about that enable me to work as a team, because I like working with other people. I
think a lot of people do also. So what are your personal aspirations for the future?
My personal aspirations, I will do any job I'm allocated, basically. I'm enjoying the responsibilities that I have now. So I chair the Health Select Committee, and as I said, I'm on Foreign Affairs. And one of the latest experiences I have, which actually I thoroughly enjoyed, was to be a member of a 13-person New Zealand team that was part of the Fiji elections.
Ah.
So I was part of they call us MOGs, Multinational Observer Group members. And so our role and function was to understand the process for people to participate in the Fiji elections, and then to go to a region. I was allocated an area to the west of the island called Singatoka, and with Terina, a young woman who I met who works for the Ministry for Pacific Peoples, we visited 7 venues and 16 polling stations, and we're there from the opening of the booths right through to the counting of votes. And so I found that a really insightful kind of role, given New Zealand's relationship with the Pacific, to the Pacific, and the fact that the Fiji government had asked us to be part of a group that I guess was there to verify that their elections were conducted in an open, honest, transparent manner. Our job was also to highlight any issues that we saw, but fundamentally it was giving reassurance to the Pacific and actually the global community that Fiji were conducting elections that actually generally represented the will of the people. And as part of that discussion, we got to interact with our High Commissioner over there, Jonathan Kerr, and he's now asked if our Commonwealth Women Parliamentarian Group would be willing to assist in providing some mentoring for some of the newer women members. So they've had 10 women elected through the elections, 10 of 50. And so the goal is for them to come to New Zealand at some point, and we will spend a week helping them with the parliamentary process, talking about how we practice being members of parliament, and then with an option that we potentially will go to Fiji to help them as they establish their careers as members of parliament.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, so that's incredibly satisfying. And
you want to do more of that?
Yeah, I do actually.
And being the best version of yourself.
I want to do more of that. I want to do more in the women's space. I want to do more in the Indigenous space. And obviously I continue to work in the LGBT space. But
yes.
Actually, if you think about all of those kind of communities that I'm really interested in, you know, there are human rights aspects to all those groups. And so I'm very passionate. And the other area I'm passionate about is sport for development, you know, and how we can create opportunities for young women and girls to play sport, because I believe through sport you can grow strong and resilient young women and girls who actually through sport and the practice of sport, like me, prepare well, you know, they understand their role, but they also know through hard work that they can achieve anything. You know, and some of that achievement is and will be breaking down some of the traditional roles that women have in their communities and societies, and also being in a position where we can leverage off that sport development and then create business opportunities or political opportunities for women to then have a different role than they may have traditionally in some of those societies.
Absolutely. So do you have a social media account or something that my followers can look you up on?
Oh yes, so I'm on
Twitter?
Instagram.
Oh, yeah.
No, I'm not on Twitter.
You're not on Twitter?
I'm on Instagram and Facebook. I chose no to Twitter. I think Twitter, yeah, I mean, from what I saw and read, and when I first went into Parliament, there was a lot of derogatory comments about me being, you know, a lesbian, and I think whale oil and some of those domains weren't very supportive of me.
Of course.
And I just now use my Facebook really to communicate what I'm doing, so people understand where I am, what I'm doing. There's a lot of time, and people don't realise that the majority of the year I'm actually in Wellington, because the house sits, you know, 36 weeks of the year. So I'm in Wellington. And more I'm going down on a Friday and maybe coming back, I go down on a Monday and maybe come back on a Friday or a Thursday night. And I just wanted people to know that if they don't see me around Manurewa, then at least they know where I am, and then they can make a decision about whether or not I'm using my time in a way that benefits our community. complements the needs and aspirations of our community, and I guess at the next election I'll find out whether or not they think I'm doing a good job.
And the voters will find out too.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me, Louisa.
Kia ora. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me, and see you all soon. Thank you.